Hi, just a few words to you today. I want to talk today a little bit about God's plan and how God's plans always come to fruition. God's plans cannot be thwarted. I've been reading through the Bible this year, and just this morning I read the story of David. David and Goliath, David assuming the throne of Israel, David overcoming his adversaries, who was his mentor, King Saul. And Saul became very jealous of David, and so much of the story is of David fleeing from Saul to spare his own life. When I was in seminary, it was pretty common at that time. Actually, I was one of the younger students. I was 27 years old, and that is when I graduated from seminary. And it was pretty common at that time for most of the students to be second career. In fact, they said that the average age of the students at the time that I was in seminary was 38.5. So that means that there were, and listening to the stories of the students, they were in banking, they were in some type of education, they were in farming or some other occupation. But God had called them years and years earlier, maybe as a youth at summer camp, or maybe as a college student. God had called them into the ministry, but they took a different path. And now at age 38, they are finding themselves in seminary classrooms, studying theology, studying Bible, studying church ministry. And the reason is because God's plan cannot be thwarted. If God calls somebody to the ministry, and that person is willing to be part of God's plan, and that's the key right there, is if a person is willing to be part of God's call, then God is going to pursue them and bring them to the place. And this is not a sadistic move on God's part. Rather, this is an incredible love that God has for us. So the story is of Saul. Saul was sent to destroy the Amalekites. Saul was the king, and God said, I want you to go and completely destroy the Amalekites. I want you to kill every person. I want you to destroy all of their livestock, that there's not one smidget of Amalekite life left on this planet. And God had a reason for that, and that is because the Amalekites would always be pursuing them, always being their thorn in the flesh. And so God gave a command, and lo and behold, Saul obeyed the command, except he kept a lot of the good livestock. Oh, also he kept the king. They brought the king back and spared the king. And Samuel got word of this, the prophet. God had told Samuel that Saul had disobeyed him, that he had not destroyed the Amalekites as he was told. And so God's basic words to Samuel the prophet was, I reject Saul as king over Israel and Judah. And so from that point on, even though Saul remained as the king for a period of time, he was not under God's favor anymore. In fact, the Spirit of the Lord departed from him. In fact, he was given a tormenting spirit. I don't know if you'd describe that as depression or bipolar or what it was, but it was a tormenting spirit that would not allow him any peace in his life. Now then there's David. David comes along, the youngest of the most unlikely, the most unlikely of all the brothers of the sons of Jesse. And he was a shepherd boy out in the fields. And after Samuel had dismissed all the other brothers, he said, is there no other one of your sons that I can look at? And Jesse said, oh yeah, there is this one son, but he's not really who you're looking for, but he's out in the field tending the sheep right now. I'll go get him. And so David is brought before, and of course that's who God approved as the king, the future king of Israel. But Saul wasn't quite done yet. Saul wasn't done with being king. He continued as king, and David was called in as a servant to soothe Saul by playing on his harp, and it brought him great relief because he was able to be sort of free from that evil spirit for a while, and so it helped him. But then Saul was filled with incredible anger toward David. And Saul overheard some of the women chanting one day in the streets. I think it was the women, but chanting in the streets. Um, uh, Saul has killed his thousands, but David has killed his 10,000s. And Saul became just filled with anger and rage and jealousy. And so while David was playing the harp 3 different times, um, Saul flung a spear at David and tried to pin him to the wall. And then on another occasion, it happened again. So the 4th time, and that time David fled the palace and hid in caves and ran from Saul for many, many months until Saul was no longer in power. Here's the fact: nothing that could have been done would have allowed Saul to keep the throne. Absolutely, God had deposed him, and nothing that he could have done could have caused him to retain the throne. And then there's, for David, nothing that could have been done could have prevented David from becoming the next king, because God's plan cannot be thwarted. Now, if God has a plan for your life, which I believe God has a plan for each of our lives, and you're willing to listen to what God has for your life, his plan will not be thwarted. His plan will come to fruition. Those are the words I want to leave with you today. God bless.